The only thing that seems capable to me of addressing climate change as a global problem is a centralized global government that's able to address economic and social justice issues with some sense of equality, and to redistribute economic goods, right, in a centralized way. And so that does seem to me, in an abstract way, like the only possible approach to deal with this global problem. I don't believe that it's going to happen. It doesn't seem likely to me at all.
Thank you so much for joining us here tonight. My name is Kate Bruns, and on behalf of Harvard Bookstore and our co-sponsors tonight, 350 Mass and Mass Humanities, I am so pleased to welcome you to tonight's event with Roy Scranton, discussing his latest book, We're Doomed, Now What? Essays on War and Climate Change. I wasn't sure on the inflection there, so I went with that one. He'll be joined in conversation by Andrew Basevich. So now I would like to invite up Alexis Rizzuto from 350 Mass to say a few words before our event begins.
Thanks, Kate. Good evening. I would like to first thank Roy Scranton for his important work. And I would also like to thank Harvard Bookstore for giving us a few minutes to talk about our organization, 350 Mass for a Better Future. Some of you may have heard of 350.org, which was founded by Bill McKibben in Vermont. I think it was 2009. It's a national and international organization centered on climate change. And just a quick explanation of what 350 stands for. It's the parts per million of carbon in the atmosphere that's allowable before we would raise the global temperature 2 degrees Celsius, which is bad news. Right now, we are over 410 parts per million, so we need to get back down to 350. So the 350 chapter in Massachusetts was founded in 2012, and I was so happy when I discovered that they were starting a group here, because I got the "we're doomed" part, but I didn't get the answer to "now what" yet. So when I found 350, I thought, oh, and here we have something. We have a group of like-minded people who are concerned about this, and we have actions that we can take. And that's the important part, because I find that action is the antidote to the despair that people who think about climate change for any amount of time might feel. I want to just read a quick quote from Raising My Child in a Doomed World, which is an essay in the book that we're talking about tonight. Roy writes, "Our children will not face the choices we face. They won't have the opportunities we now have for action. They'll confront a range of outcomes whose limits were determined by the choices we made." So we can make a choice to take action, and that's what I'm just here to talk about very quickly for one more minute. 350 and other climate organizations take different actions, have different campaigns. Most of them are basically focused on supporting renewable energy and green energy, and making sure that we move away from fossil fuels. And we're doing that. We're focusing this at the state and local levels. Examples of actions are writing a letter to the editor of your local newspaper, calling a legislator, joining a march, educating other people, coming to meetings of organizations like 350 or Sierra Club or Mothers Out Front, which is a parentally focused climate organization. We at 350 Mass meet twice a month, right in Cambridge, right down the road. And if you're interested in finding out more information about that, we have these handy-dandy little flyers on the table, and we're going to be passing around a sign-up sheet just if you would like more information. So once again, thank you for listening, and I am now going to turn the mic over back to Kate.
Thank you so much, Alexis. And so now I am very pleased to introduce tonight's speakers. Roy Scranton is the author of 2 previous books, War Porn and Learning to Die in the Anthropocene, Reflections on the End of Civilization. He has also co-edited What Future? The Year's Best Ideas to Reclaim, Reanimate, and Reinvent Our Future, and Fire and Forget, Short Stories from the Long War. Roy is joined tonight by Andrew Bacevich, Professor Emeritus of International Relations and History at BU. He is also the author of numerous books, including Washington Rules, America's Path to Permanent War, and The Limits of Power, The End of American Exceptionalism.
Thank you, Kate, for that introduction. And thanks to the Harvard Bookstore for having me here. I also want to thank WGBH and the Forum Network for filming this and bringing it to a wider audience. Alexis and 350 Mass and Mass Humanities for your support in co-sponsoring this event and your work. And also Andrew for being here. There's, to me, no more clear-eyed and insightful analyst of American power in the world than this guy right here. So I'm really delighted to have him. And thank you all for showing up. It's really, it means a lot to see so many people here who believe that we're doomed, just like me. No, who are concerned about climate change, or at least looking for air conditioning. As Kate mentioned, we're going to have some time for questions and discussion, but first I'm just going to read a short piece from the book titled The Precipice. Again and again and yet again, we imagine ourselves at the precipice. We must change our ways today, this very hour, or else we'll really have to face the consequences. We see ourselves at the cliff's edge, trembling with anxiety, our toes kicking stones into the abyss. We summon all of our inner resources. We will ourselves to action. This is it, we say. It's now or never. Then something catches our attention. Dinner, Twitter, soccer, Trump. Before we know it, life pulls us back into its comforting ebb and flow. We recognize a missed opportunities, in some vague sense, the nagging tingle of having passed a decision by, but tell ourselves next time. The sun will rise again tomorrow, and then, refreshed, we can begin our struggle anew. We may not have fully faced the crisis, it's true, but of course that can only mean that the real crisis hasn't yet arrived, because if it had, we would have faced it. We still have a chance. The fight still goes on. In 1988, Dr. James Hansen, then director of NASA's Institute for Space Studies, testified before the United States Senate Energy and Natural Resources Committee, telling them, with all the qualifications empiricism makes for its claims, that evidence of anthropogenic global warming was very strong, and furthermore, warning them that continuing to emit greenhouse gases by burning fossil fuels at then current rates would lead to significant and dangerous changes in the Earth's climate, including rising sea levels, increased temperatures, and drought. Hansen was not the first to warn of the danger, but his warning was clear and reported widely. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change was established that same year by the United Nations, and the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change a few years later. In December 1997, the Annex I parties of the UNFCCC adopted the Kyoto Protocol, committing the industrialized nations of the world, including the United States, to reducing greenhouse gas emissions to, quote, a level that would prevent dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate system. That treaty, however, was never ratified by the Senate, before which Hansen had testified. Indeed, that body voted unanimously to oppose signing the Kyoto Protocol, passing in July 1997 the Byrd-Hagel resolution, which argued that such an agreement, quote, would result in serious harm to the economy of the United States. The failures in the past 2 decades to adopt binding global policies to slow or stop greenhouse gas emissions, including the Copenhagen Accord and the Paris Agreement, betray to all concerned the manifest impotence of the UNFCCC in the face of national ambition and corporate greed. No doubt future historians, such as the Chinese scholar imagined by Naomi Oreskes and Eric Conway in their book, The Collapse of Western Civilization, will look back on these decades of lugubrious folly with the same confusion and regret with which historians today look back at Europe's successive capitulations to Nazi aggression in the 1930s. We imagine ourselves at the precipice, again and again and yet again, then return to business as usual. The status quo of buying and selling, driving, flying. We'll have the Wagyu beef. We'll have the pork belly. We'll turn up the heat or the lights or the air conditioning. We have a conference to go to. We have business in Palo Alto, Dubai, Cambridge. We imagine each new shock is the real crisis, and a few months later convince ourselves that the fight still goes on. Between 1988 and 2014, annual global carbon dioxide emissions increased from 21.8 billion metric tons to 36.1 billion metric tons. Estimates since then show emissions only increasing, though not as quickly as they had in the past. Thinking this slowdown in emissions growth is cause for celebration would be a mistake. The truth is, we're almost certainly already over the cliff. Each day brings new evidence that we've already missed the decisive moment, passed by the sudden crisis, left behind the revolutionary turning point when everything could have changed. We live today in the fall, in the aftertime of human progress and Western civilization, in the long, dim days of decline and collapse and retrenchment and violence and confusion and sorrow and endless, depthless, unassuageable human suffering. We live today in the Anthropocene. Several years ago, I hiked from France into Spain, following a trail through the Pyrenees used by refugees fleeing the Nazis after the fall of France. I was interested in one refugee in particular, a German Jewish essayist and critic named Walter Benjamin. He's best known today for his seminal analysis of the relationship between politics and aesthetics and mass media culture, the work of art in the age of mechanical reproduction. He was known to a few of his contemporaries in his time and is known to many readers today as a writer of strange, elusive, and rebarbatively brilliant essays on literature, culture, and history. Hannah Arendt, who knew Benjamin personally, wrote in her introduction to the 1968 collection of his essays in English translation, Illuminations, quote, "To describe adequately his work and him as an author within our usual framework of reference, one would have to make a great many negative statements, such as, his erudition was great, but he was no scholar. His subject matter comprised texts and their interpretation, but he was no philologist. He was greatly attracted not by religion, but by theology and the theological type of interpretation for which the text itself is sacred, but he was no theologian, and he was not particularly interested in the Bible. He was a born writer, but his greatest ambition was to produce a work consisting entirely of quotations. He reviewed books and wrote a number of essays on living and dead writers, but he was no literary critic. He thought poetically, but he was neither a poet nor a philosopher." Benjamin was and remains sui generis. While he's usually grouped among the thinkers of the Frankfurt School, with whom he associated in the 1920s and 30s, he never quite fit in with their rigorous sociological Marxism, and when the members of the Institute fled Europe for the United States, Benjamin stayed behind. Benjamin founded no school of thought. He cannot be emulated or followed, and yet he endures as a model of intellectual life in the modern world. Part of Benjamin's appeal, no doubt, is in the literary quality of his work, which is breathtaking. But I believe a more important aspect of his appeal lies in the seriousness of his situation, not only in the sense of his historical moment, the rise of fascism and the end of 19th century Europe, but also in his sensitivity and vulnerability to that moment, his lifelong struggle against pessimism and despair, his fatal courtship with total failure. In a few figures in every age, biography and history merge. And as a shadow fell across Europe in 1940, Benjamin wrote his theses on the philosophy of history, offering the indelible image of Paul Klee's Angelus Novus as the angel of history, wings spread and mouth agape, being blown backward into the future. Quote, "Where we perceive a chain of events, he sees one single catastrophe which keeps piling wreckage upon wreckage and hurls it in front of his feet. The angel would like to stay, awaken the dead, and make whole what has been smashed. But a storm is blowing from paradise. It has got caught in his wings with such violence that the angel can no longer close them. This storm is what we call progress." A few months after writing this, Benjamin killed himself. He was buried where he died, in Portbou, Spain. Following the trail Benjamin took when he finally decided he could no longer stay in France, I started out before dawn in the sleepy beach town of Bagnols-sur-Mer, winding up through the vineyards and the hills around town, then turning steeply into the mountains. I hiked all morning, up a rocky, winding path, which Benjamin had labored up in clunky shoes with a bad heart, carrying a suitcase full of manuscript pages, wheezing and stopping often to catch his breath. At the summit, on the border between France and Spain, I tried to imagine myself in Benjamin's place, fleeing the Nazis and what would become the Holocaust, one refugee in a stream of them, one refugee among thousands, millions, there on the border between two worlds. It's a tragic,
romantic image, the historian pursued by history on the verge of self-destruction. I struggled to understand Benjamin's suicide, to think my way into it as I descended into Port Boo, then hiked back up to the cemetery on the cliffs above the town where Benjamin is buried, as I contemplated the memorial that artist Donny Caravan had created there to honor him. Stairs going down a steel passage, piercing the cliff, ending in a glass wall suspended dizzyingly above the crashing waves of the Mediterranean. Into the glass are etched these words: "It is a more arduous task to honor the memory of anonymous beings than that of famous persons. The construction of history is consecrated to the memory of those who have no name." I strove to make sense of Benjamin's decision when he found out that the group of refugees he'd come with would be turned back across the border to take a killing dose of morphine. I worked to imagine myself in the position of someone with no exit, no feeling that the future had anything to offer but more catastrophe, no sense of a chance for ease or relief or safety, no hope. I tried to imagine the moment of now or never. The sun flared over the blue waters of the Mediterranean, and far below, late-season beachgoers swam and played in the waves. Teenagers flirted and chased each other. Children ran up and down the sand. I tried to concentrate, but my thoughts kept returning to lunch. The moment passed. I had a sandwich. Life went on, and I went back to Bagnols-sur-Mer, then Paris, then New York, and so on. But in a very important sense, I'm still there in Port Boo with Benjamin, because we're all in Port Boo with Benjamin. We are each of us the incarnation of the angel of history, our faces turned toward the catastrophe of the past, being blown backward into a future we didn't choose. I'm not a climate scientist. I'm not a Benjamin scholar. I'm not a professional philosopher. I'm a novelist and sometime journalist and an essayist. My scholarly training is in 20th century American literature, poetics, and intellectual history. My tools are historicism and close reading and narrative, images and rhetorics and concepts. So what do I do? What do we do? What can mere words do for a doomed civilization? The range of action seems narrow and mostly ineffectual. Alerting people to the problem and educating broad audiences has proven ineffective against deliberately sown confusion, deep scientific ignorance, widespread apathy, and outright hostility. Naomi Klein makes a very important point in her book, This Changes Everything, that those who are invested materially in fossil-fueled capitalism will also be invested ideologically in opposing public recognition of the scope of global climate change, since the threat, properly understood, would demand an immediate dismantling of the global economy and the overthrow of those who rule it. Warning people of the danger we face only seems to sow anxiety and fear, much like the jolt of the latest Fox News terror alert, and to provoke not restraint, but scapegoating and aggression. Almost nowhere is anybody grappling seriously with the implications of the catastrophe that is already happening, in which we already live, while everywhere people are trying to find ways to keep moving forward. How do we move forward? We just need to keep moving forward. But where are we going? If we thought clearly about our situation for one moment, we would see the end of the passage down which we're so intently moving forward. Here, in our daily speech, we find again the notion of progress to which our form of civilization remains addicted, the storm blowing us into the future, without which our conquering ideologies would be meaningless. In my book, Learning to Die in the Anthropocene, I rely on Peter Sloterdijk for the concept of interruption. The idea, as Sloterdijk frames it, is to suspend our participation in stress semantic chains. We are inescapably social animals. We rush along with our mass protests and our memes and our nationalism, moving forward, feeling it all together. The idea of interruption is not to resist this impulse or to react against it, but to sit with it, meditate on it, ponder it, suspend our progress until we see where we're going. Suspend our process until something else happens. In the moment of suspension, new possibility opens. This, I argue, is what we might learn in learning to die. By sitting with and meditating on and thinking deeply the idea of our death as individuals and as a civilization, we open ourselves to the life we lead right now. In his essay Theses on the Philosophy of History, Benjamin writes, quote, "The themes which monastic discipline assigned to friars for meditation were designed to turn them away from the world and its affairs. The thoughts we are developing here originate from similar considerations." Part of Benjamin's appeal, I think, is that his thoughts are so vividly conceived, Jetztzeit, this idea of now time, the tiger's leap, the angel of history, brushing history against the grain, that we think we know what they mean. We think we know what Benjamin means, at least roughly, at least in some sense. He's talking about revolution and messianism and how to think about the work we do as humanities scholars and artists and essayists and thinkers so that we might remain connected to some salvific impulse, even while recognizing that history is made by the victors, that, in his famous phrase, there is no document of civilization which is not at the same time a document of barbarism. But I wonder if we have not misconstrued the thrust of the theses and thus missed Benjamin's deeper point. Recalling the feelings of isolation and pessimism with which he wrote these thoughts, hunted and harried and ill, thinking of him poised on the summit in the mountains between France and Spain, caught between two worlds, the theses appear in a new light. They seem to argue that the work of the thinker is to stop time. Quote, "A historical materialist cannot do without the notion of a present which is not a transition," Benjamin writes, "but in which time stands still and has come to a stop." Many have recognized, of course, the import of Benjamin's argument here in historiographic terms as methodology, for Benjamin is explicit about what that means. The historian, or properly speaking, the historical materialist, seeks to free from the grip of the victorious enemy who has subsumed all history into a universal history, the memory of anonymous beings, those who have no name, and even the dead, and does so by defying the forward momentum implicit in all teleology, even and especially those historical narratives that bring us to the present. Thinking involves not only the flow of thoughts, he writes, but their arrest as well. It is through that arrest, that interruption, that a historical moment can become, in Benjamin's view, quote, time filled by the presence of the now, what he called Jetztzeit. But Benjamin is writing not only as a historical materialist, not only as a historian, but as a scholar, critic, and philosopher, as a German and as a Jew, deeply concerned with justice, yet also struggling always against a miasma of pessimism and despair, watching with horror the rise of fascism and the dissolution of everything he loved. He's writing as a humanist witnessing the end of his world. It is only with this in mind, it seems to me, that we can begin to recognize the other way in which Benjamin understood the import of stopping time, which is as a form of resistance to the demand that we keep moving forward. And indeed, perhaps the only ethical thought available to a thinker whose future is foreclosed, as is ours, by doom. Benjamin's theses thus suggest at once a model and a method for thought in the Anthropocene, while still leaving open important practical questions yet to be addressed. For even if Benjamin's historical materialism offers a kind of methodological analog to the philosophical practice of learning to die, we remain, nevertheless, within the sequence of historical causality as much as we remain within the stress semantic chains of daily life. And while the practice of thought or meditation might work to suspend or interrupt the latter, the practices by which we might suspend history itself have yet to be adequately articulated. As we tumble over the precipice into the darkness, we realize that the light coming up from below is the sea rising to meet us. There is nothing between us and the abyss but a moment of suspended time, like a sheet of glass on which is etched an image drawn in words, a moment, a remembrance. Thanks.
Bummer. Just joking. So it's my great pleasure to be here with Roy to talk about his latest book. Roy is a veteran of the Iraq War. And he and I met, correct me if I'm wrong, 2 summers ago in Berkeley, California, at the annual meeting of the Veterans for Peace organization.
That's right.
And we were, in fact, roommates. I think
True.
Roy is the only roommate I have had other than my wife over at least the past 30 years. So that's where we got to meet each other. Now, the fact that Roy is interested not only in climate change, but also in war, one might argue that the two are not unconnected, is to me something that lends to his writing and his thinking particular interest. And I hope in our discussion we can pursue that link between climate change and war. Now, it is now 7:30. We've got 30 minutes. You want to talk. My plan is to ask 3 questions of Roy. He can answer as long as he wants, but when we're done with the 3 questions, then I will invite you all to ask questions until we have to adjourn. So question number 1. Most essays have a shelf life of probably somewhere between a day and a half and 2 weeks. You have chosen to collect your essays written over the course of the past few years as a book. Talk to us just a little bit about why you chose to put them into book form.
Sure. Well, partly it was because precisely what you talk about. Most essays, and there's some of these pieces have not been published before. What I just read hasn't been published before. Other pieces have, and some of the journalism I did, for example, I did a piece on the Arctic sea ice collapse and the opening of the Northwest Passage. And I did a piece on storm surge suppression in Houston and some philosophical approaches to climate change. Like those pieces, reported pieces, I spent months and months on trying to think deeply about climate change and how we're dealing with it, and how it's a practical problem, but it's even more deeply, I think, a philosophical and kind of existential problem. Those pieces got published, and then they're around for a week or so, and then we move on to the next thing. And I really wanted to take a lot of these thoughts and put them together in a place where they might participate more deeply in a conversation that's going on about how we make sense of climate change and how that's related to American imperialism and violence and war. So that was a major impetus, was to try to put them together. And as well, they also, a lot of the pieces have to do with sort of that big question of how we make meaning together, which is pretty abstract, but how we make meaning together, both in discourse and in the things that we do, in social rituals, in actions like war, and how these impact us down the years, and putting these pieces together, they resonate off each other, I think, in ways that deepen and enrich what each piece is doing.
The sum is greater than the parts.
I think so. My editor thought so too. Yeah. I also I had the chance to study when I was in graduate school at the New School, study with Christopher Hitchens before he died, obviously, and he gave me a piece of advice. He said, always publish everything twice. So that was that was my other thought.
It's an economic argument, though.
Right.
So, listening to your talk, I'm just reminded again about the need for what most of us would see as radical change.
Mm-hmm.
And my question is this: do you think that the current constitutional order, and I don't mean the fact that President Trump is in the White House, I'm talking about the mechanisms of governance that we have evolved long before Trump showed up on the scene, is the current constitutional order capable of mustering a response to climate change that could even minimally make a difference? Or for some sort of serious effort, would we first require some form of a political revolution?
That's a difficult question to answer because I believe in democracy. I believe in, as an ideal, the ideal of collective rational self-determination. That it's articulated in the Enlightenment and in the founding documents of this country, and in the process, as messy as it can be, as a way of doing things. I believe in that, and yet, if we think hard about the necessary steps that would be required at this point to address climate change, it seems clear that the constitutional arrangement, the institutions of governance that we have in this country, are not adequate, are not capable of dealing with the problem. First off, I mean, there's the issue of the problem's global scale, which is to say that even if there was a political revolution in the United States and some sort of centralized power was able to do what needed to be done to make climate, to completely take us off fossil fuels and begin reducing emissions and invested in carbon capture and sequestration and so on, then there's still China and India and Russia and so on and so on. There's that aspect to it.
So it would have to be revolution on a global scale.
The problem is of that scale, right? So that seems there would have to be a kind of global coordination on a scale and of a form that we have never seen in history.
Which would presume a sort of a global consciousness that we here in America, and the Chinese in China, and the Europeans in Europe, and Brazilians in Brazil, etc., would all concur on a set of priorities that put climate change somewhere up near number one, and would also then concur on a common collaborative course of action that I assume would have to be a heck of a lot bolder than the Paris Accords. Is that how's that going to happen?
Right. I mean, this is one of the problems. So that often in the discourse on climate change, there's this we talk about what we need to do. We need to reduce emissions. We need to do this. We need to do that. But this "we" does not exist, right? There is no unified global political subject, right? There is no global consciousness on this scale that agrees that climate change is the number one priority. There is an abstract, disaggregate bunch of individuals, right, who make up the we, who are all going to die in our individual ways in storms and drought and war. It's an intractable problem that seems to offer no clear way forward at this point.
So my last question, playing off of the storms and the drought and the wars, is to suggest that your overall outlook tends toward pessimism. So does mine, don't feel bad. But yet you have recently added a daughter, baby girl, to your family. And I think it's true that having a child tends to suggest an element of hopefulness. So how do you square your outlook on the problems we face with the changes in your family?
Right. So, do I contradict myself? And in fact, the last piece in this book is Raising a Daughter in a Doomed World. It's the one that Alexis quoted from. Things don't square up quite in a very neat way. But I will say two things. The first is that there is still, I think
the global problem of catastrophic anthropogenic climate change does seem intractable. We are committed at this point to catastrophic warming, and it's possible, maybe even probable, that we've already gone past what the scientists talk about, the tipping points that begin a cascade of feedback effects that could launch runaway warming. And yet there is still the possibility for some mitigation and adaptation. I'm sorry to say to my hosts, I don't think we're ever going to get back down to 350 parts per million. But there is some possibility, perhaps, for some amount of mitigation, and the range of possibilities at this point, right? There's still a chance for the continuation of the human species, and maybe civilization in some recognizable, global human civilization in some recognizable form. We're not necessarily committed to the collapse of life as we know it and human extinction. That's possible, right? That's a sort of the more extreme end, but it does seem that there is some chance to sort of soften the blow, and as well to make commitments to future generations to pass something worthwhile on. The other thing I would say is that in another essay in here, one about going back to Baghdad as a journalist in 2014 to sort of reflect on the American occupation there 10 years after I'd been there as a soldier, I talked to an Iraqi poet who, when the U.S. invaded in 2003, was overjoyed. He was dancing in the street. He was so excited because members of his family had been tortured and imprisoned by Saddam, and he believed in democracy. And of course, by the time I talked to him, he was totally cynical about Iraq's prospects and about the American occupation and what had happened there. And so I asked him, do you have any hope for Iraq's future? And what he told me was that on the other side of hopelessness, there's a new kind of hope. That he's found a faith in the basic tissue of human existence. And when we think about human life on Earth, right, 200,000 whatever years of it, right, most of it's been pretty catch as catch can, pretty miserable, pretty, you have to, you don't have central air, you don't have air conditioning, you don't fly, you don't have, these nice shoes and everything. You have to make everything yourself and so on. But at the same time, right, those people are just like us, right? The humans that came before us. And they lived lives as rich and joyful and meaningful as our own, right? Just because we've become accustomed to a certain level of material comfort and security does not mean that the richness and the possibility for joy in our existence is predicated on that material life. So, there is a sort of hope, not necessarily that my daughter will be able to have the kinds of options that I've had, or will be able to depend on infrastructure and kinds of security and ease, clean tap water and running electricity and so on in the ways that I have. And there's certainly, her life is going to be a difficult one. And yet, I do have the hope that she can live as rich and meaningful a life as anyone. So that's sort of what I got on that.
Good. Okay, so we have 16 minutes to go before we adjourn, and then you can line up. All of you will line up to buy a book that he will sign. But in the interim, it's my job to identify people to ask questions, and I will do my darndest to ensure that we have, if nothing else, gender balance. Almost always when I do these things, the first 6 questions come from men. You have to sort of, so I'm looking for a woman to raise her hand. Yes, ma'am.
Compared to the amount of people, the population in the whole Earth, let's say 20 years out, and the sea has gone up half an inch. How much land do we really have for all of these people to fit on, and how much is going to be useless? I mean, what is the ratio? And why? And wars are going to go on forever and ever because of that, right?
I'm sorry, you mean how much land will be lost as a
how much
result
will be
of
left?
sea level increasing?
How much will be left when sea level goes up?
How much will be
It's
left?
a little bit.
Okay.
And how will we do that?
Right. So, well, it's hard to say. One of the frightening things about climate change is that while the trend lines are, and the broad picture is very clear, the exact specifics remain uncertain. Right. So, depending on how things go, we could see much of the United States, say, south of, Nebraska or even Iowa or something, no longer capable of producing agriculture in the same way, right? The same perhaps with California, and we can see, we may see significant damage to places like Miami and New Orleans and even New York, right? That may make parts of them inhospitable and uninhabitable. But the exact specifics are much, right? I'm not like a climate scientist, so I don't have that data at my fingertips, but it's not even data. Those are sort of just models, right, to look at what's likely to happen. I can say that the global population continues to increase, and in many ways, we've already sort of burst the boundary conditions for sustainable life on Earth through population and all these other sort of technological aspects that scientists sort of refer to as the Great Acceleration in the past 50 years. There are sort of engineering solutions. If you sort of put everybody into cities and you do like green building and all this stuff, you could totally revolutionize the way we live on Earth. But then again, it's the problem of how that happens, right? Who's the governing entity that's going to force that, or incentivize that. And so I don't know, but my suspicion is that it's going to be pretty messy. Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Well, I'm wondering how you square your abstract beliefs with your personal habits. You said elsewhere that you've given up a car, that you've given up meat, that you've given up a kid, that you've given up planes and so forth. So I'm wondering if your kind of abstract belief in this world socialist chimera, since there's never even been a socialist successful experiment in one country, let alone in the entire world, is a kind of sop or a self-deception that allows you to go on living a self-indulgent bourgeois lifestyle in the present.
Did he propose socialism? I missed that part.
In another talk he did.
Oh.
Yeah, and the raising, right.
Good question. Let's
Yeah.
let him answer.
Right. So that's a great question, and I do talk about it in that same essay, Raising a Daughter in a Doomed World. And what I say there is that it's sort of basically what I said just now, is that the only thing that seems capable to me of addressing climate change as a global problem is a centralized global government that's able to address economic and social justice issues with some sense of equality, and to redistribute economic goods, right, in a centralized way. And so that does seem to me in an abstract way like the only possible approach to deal with this global problem. I don't believe that it's going to happen. It doesn't seem likely to me at all. I do think we can move that direction toward more equitable economic system, and more taking care of poor people and so on, right? all the great things, democratic socialism and so on. I mean, economic inequality is not only a problem in all kinds of moral and ethical ways, but it also makes our society less resilient. It makes it more fragile to infrastructural collapse. And this is an argument that I'm not just making from out of thin air, but it's been shown that this is one of that economic inequality is historically a marker of societies that are vulnerable to collapse. So, I mean, that's a real issue. In terms of my own personal choices, I do, I talk about the logic of personal choice, right, and how that has become, in the absence of any sense of structural transformation or real sense of mass political commitment, the logic of personal choice has become the predominant way we think about climate change, but it's not going to do it, right? I could give up everything. I could go live in the woods. I could, like David Buckle, I could light myself on fire in Prospect Park in Brooklyn, as he did earlier this year. And it's not going to stop climate change, right? It's not going to change the world, right? And even if millions of people did it, right? The fact is that billions of people live subsistence existences right now, right? They already live carbon minimal lives, right? They're just not the ones who are living the bourgeois existence that most of us in this room are a part of, and that's not even to speak of the even wealthier, right? The people who are, wasting even more. There's no. I mean, this is the problem, right? This is partly why we feel so frustrated and disempowered, is that there seems no way to get a grasp on it, either through personal action or through this socialist chimera, right? We're here, and it's all happening, and we have to work it out together. Like, how do we make this transition? How do we go through this catastrophe? That's the question I come to again and again in the piece that you're talking about, and in other pieces, is that the real question isn't whether to give up driving or to give up flying or to not eat meat. I mean, we should, probably give up beef and pork, but whatever. The real question is how we live ethically in a world that's falling apart around us and that is only going to get worse, right? That's the question. How do we live ethically together in a world on fire?
But you're back to your problem of who's the we. Yes,
Right.
ma'am.
My thought is that we're probably talking about revolution and war. Eventually, that's probably what's going to have to happen. And we're speculating about and feeling kind of hopeless about what we do today. And I do want to ask, since the conservative movement, sorry for all of you who might be a part of it, have been so incredibly successful with what's happening in our country right now, I want to know how we can fight dirty and still have an ethical stance in our own.
Has anybody ever fought dirty and maintained an ethical stance?
Well,
Just your understanding of history?
Well, I would guess yes.
And who? Just
For
give us a
example,
couple examples.
When we fought Hitler, it's not pretty, but things are much muddier and more complicated than we want to look at. And I think that the fight, if what you're saying is true, and I know it is, it's so dire and so serious, and so many people in this country don't have a clue. And partly because all the interests and powers want to make sure that we don't. And I'm not a conspiratorist at all. I'm just stating what I think of the facts. What can we do that is going to be effective? We have to fight, and maintain some kind of integrity.
I'm not sure why you blame conservative. I mean, it seems to me liberals are equally committed to corporate capitalism and
Right.
materialistic life.
So,
Oh, I'm sorry.
what?
I don't mean to hijack your answer here. We have to let him answer
So-
because we got other people waiting.
Yeah.
Is
how
there
do
a
we-
way for us to fight
Yeah.
dirty for a good
How do-
cause?
Yeah, how do we start fighting dirty? And so, I'll say there's a. I mean, that's another hard question. So I'll say a couple things about that. One is that so I think in a certain sense you're right. Like I look at the labor history of this country, right, and the reason that there was an 8-hour day and a minimum wage and labor rights was because people fought and died for that against Pinkerton agents and National Guard and they stood up and they fought, and if we're serious, if one is serious about responding in a physical manner to the urgency and direness of the situation, then one cannot help but go that way in one's thoughts about tactics, right? You can point to numerous examples throughout history where political movements have turned to violence because that seemed the only real option forward. I'm not. I can't go there. In part because.
Well, you don't need to go there. The reason you don't need to go there is because we don't need to fight dirty. I mean, what is required is the big we, however we define the big we, requires a change in consciousness. And we have historical examples of massive changes in consciousness that occur without resort to large-scale violence. Give me 2 examples. Martin Luther King is one. Mahatma Gandhi is another one. That's how you change consciousness, then you change policy.
Let me say this one thing. And we can talk about how the civil rights movement was really only possible with the support of the federal government behind it and armed troops, right, in Alabama and Arkansas. But the bigger issue is violence cannot be controlled, right? What I saw in Iraq as a soldier, what I've seen looking at history is that we might think, okay, we just unleash this targeted violence. We just decide we're going to be ethical about it and we're going to do this, and it takes on its own life and its own energy. And realistically, whatever sort of notion of violent revolution one might be talking about, realistically, it would take. First of all, its chances of success are practically nil because of the massive military forces and police forces that the government controls. But second, it would take so long and put so much carbon into the atmosphere that it would be too late by then. You would be fighting over a garbage pit.
Yeah, we'd solve the overpopulation problem, no?
So
I think we have time for one more question.
One or
two more
more
questions?
All right.
One or two.
One or two. So it depends on how concise you are, ma'am.
I'll try to make it very concise. I'd like to come back to that link, those similarities between climate change on the one hand and war on the other, and then going back to that question of how do we create a we. So my thought is, and maybe this is literally just me being from Europe, and I'm far from being sort of all illusioned about this. Europe is not in a good state at the moment, but what we do have is a catastrophe in terms of war, ending in a more or less sort of common, again more or less, right, asterisk, identity, and in fact a commitment to peace and to tackle climate change. So the question is to you, do you see any lessons that we as a whole, as a global population, could learn from the European example?
The answer has to be yes.
Well, sir, you mean the European example of
EU.
the EU and integration? Well,
And learning the lessons of the two world wars.
right.
Some lessons.
You know, there was a period of tremendous prosperity and peace following those wars that made peace easy in a lot of ways, and there was a massive American investment in Europe, in Western Europe. But also, if you talk about, you talk about peace in Europe, you're also talking about Cold War that spans the most of the 20th century, right? Where military forces were face to face and prepared to destroy each other. So the peace in Europe that that was a product of World War II, and we saw sort of emerging in a broader sense after the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989. And we were just talking about this earlier. Seems in some sense perhaps a historical anomaly, and maybe a golden age that seems to be moving into its twilight. I think there are certainly lessons from there, as with any moment in history. Yeah, I don't know if it's necessarily a great angle on climate change.
So, we're out of time. Very grateful for all of you to come. Grateful for this wonderful presentation. We gave you some challenging questions. You did very well. Now it's time to belly up here, folks. Just 20% off, right? 20% off autographed copy. Thank you, Roy.
Thank you, Andrew, and thanks everybody for your questions and comments.